Good evening, everyone, and thank you all so much for joining me tonight. I am really excited to be back in the saddle, so to speak, and doing one of these. So tonight, I have Kacen Callender with me. Kacen Callender was born 2 days after a hurricane and was first brought home to a house without its roof. After spending their first 18 years on St. Thomas of the U.S. Virgin Islands, Kacen studied Japanese, fine arts, and creative writing at Sarah Lawrence College and received their MFA from the New School. Kacen is the author of the middle grade novel Hurricane Child and the young adult series This Kind of an Epic Love Story and Felix Ever After. They are also the author of the fantasy duology Islands of Blood and Storm, which includes Queen of the Conquered and King of the Rising, which released today. You can connect with Kacen on their website at www.kacencallender.com. So Kacen, first and foremost, thank you so much for being here tonight. This is a lot of fun for me. As I was sort of saying before the show, I love to talk to people about different kinds of fantasy.
Right. Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here for the launch of King of the Rising.
Yeah. So I guess the first question is, and I didn't realize this was a term before coming into the book world, why a duology? That's, why not a trilogy or a sequel just to come in and go, nope, it's 2 books. Why? How did that decision get made?
Yeah, well, I'll be perfectly honest. It was more of a behind-the-scenes publishing company decision where we actually went to them, I think only with Queen of the Conquered, and then they came back and said, we're interested in this, but do you think it can be 2 books? And I remember at the time I was very hesitant because I was like, Queen of the Conquered is very specifically about a character who does not change and does not grow. So basically, if there is a second book from her perspective, it would be the same story. It's a tragedy, so the whole point is that she doesn't change or grow or learn from her consequences. So I remember being very like, well, I just don't think that there would be any point to a second book because it would again just be Sigourney's story with her not changing. Mm-hmm. But then the more and more I thought about it, the more I realized, well, Lauren has always been kind of like this antithesis to Sigourney, and they are kind of like in this combating, like he is a symbol of the other side of the spectrum, and they're in this combating kind of debate over how to win our freedom, so to speak. So from there I was like, well, yeah, it would make a lot of sense to have a second book from Lauren's perspective instead. So that's what King of the Rising is.
Awesome. So tell us a little bit about, I hesitate to say, like, give us the elevator pitch for the book, because I feel like that puts people on the spot. But tell us a little bit about it. Where, I guess, what is the general idea behind it, and then where did that come from?
Right. I should have decided this beforehand if I was going to be willing to spoil Queen of the Conquered tonight.
Good point. I'm not sure. It's up to you, though. We run as spoiler heavy or light as you want.
Right. Yeah, it's really hard to talk about King of the Rising without spoiling Queen of the Conquered. But I guess I'll just say in general, both of the books were born from the kind of idea that as an oppressed person, I still have privilege, and kind of like grappling between having oppression, being oppressed, but also being given power to oppress others. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of, I think that's something a lot of people grapple with and try to kind of like make sense of. And I think that there are a lot of conversations around that. For example, like the idea of assimilation basically is that this idea that we have to assimilate to the higher power of our society, and that means like stepping on other people to get there. And basically me being against that, like I'm against that, and I kind of showed that through, just have to make that clear. Yep. I showed that through making Sigourney Rose. You're not supposed to like Sigourney Rose at all. I'm always surprised when people say that they thought that she was like a badass character, or they really enjoyed her. She is supposed to be morally ambiguous in the sense that I think that as an author, my job is to make every character's motivation understandable and sympathetic, but she's definitely supposed to be a very hated character in the sense that she does not grow and learn, and she wants power, and she's willing to do whatever it takes to get to that power, and she kind of like lies to herself about it. So that's basically what the symbolic theme meaning of book 1 is. I should say like what the plot is, I guess, like the actual summary is that Sigourney Rose, like her entire family has been killed, slaughtered her people, have been enslaved by these people called the Furin, who are colonizers in this Caribbean-inspired fantasy world. So she wants to get to the royal island to win power back from the colonizers, and there's this magic system that's called craft. Excuse me, sorry, I have my email on still. So there's like this power system that's called craft, and she is able to control minds, and that is the way that she got onto the island to kind of like manipulate her way there, and she's like trying to take power back from the colonizers. I'm not going to spoil what actually happens, but then book 2 is from Lauren's perspective, and Lauren is her bodyguard, but basically slave, and he is leading a revolution against the colonizers and against Sigourney, and he basically has to decide, okay, but like assimilation isn't the way to go. We're not willing to step on other people to get there, but it is about like how much empathy do we have for the people that have harmed us, and are we willing to basically just burn everything to the ground to begin again?
So it's interesting. I feel like with a lot of books, we get drawn in by a character. We relate to a character. We want to be a character. We want to experience things this character's experience. We want that character to be our friend necessarily. And in this case, it really is the story that's the main focus. And yes, this Sigourney's there, but they're not, as you pointed out, we're not supposed to necessarily really be rooting for them in the way that we tend to with a lot of other books. Was that a difficult thing? Was that a difficult thing for you to write? Going in intentionally and saying, "Look, this is not going to be about her journey because she doesn't have a journey. There's not a lesson learned along the way." Or was it something that you wrote this book and then it happened and you went, "Oh, well, this works then actually"?
It wasn't. Yeah, I kind of went in wanting to create a morally ambiguous character, and I felt like it was easy to do because I feel like every human being is a morally ambiguous person. It's always interesting to me when there's a story where the character has zero flaws, and I say interesting because from my perspective it just basically means, like you said, like, yeah, we want like a kind of like ideal person that can be like our friend that we want to read about, but for me it's almost harder to read because it just doesn't feel as truthful. It doesn't feel as honest. I feel like every person has a flaw, something that they have to learn and grow from. And in that sense, I feel like Sigourney's character was pretty easy to write from because I was just basically being honest. Like, I had to be vulnerable with myself. I had to be vulnerable with the different things that I've wanted in my life, and how, like, I, for example, was in the corporate world for a while, and I felt like I was kind of like following this capitalistic idea of, okay, I want power in this world also, and having to like realize that was wrong because I was willing to not necessarily, well, I don't think I was willing to step on people the same way that Sigourney is willing to step on them in the story, but basically still kind of like following this idea of capitalism and figuring out that was wrong and that is not helpful for our society as a whole. I feel like that took some vulnerability, but once I got to that place of just being vulnerable, it felt easy to write an honest character.
Sure. And I think that's also a good point. We are all obviously the protagonists of our own story, and at the same time, we've all certainly been the antagonists of someone else's story. I happen to think I'm occasionally mostly a decent person, and yet I promise there are certainly people out there who, for whom, when we interacted, when we intersected, I was the bad guy. And I think that there's something very honest about seeing that in literature as well, with a character and recognizing that, you may not be the hero of this story necessarily. So let me ask you a little bit about the world then, because changing gears, we had talked earlier before the show about sort of fantasy in general and how at times it can get kind of tiring to read. I call them like English fantasies, where it's somewhere where everyone has a vaguely English accent and the soups are very hearty and there's a chosen one and they may or may not be a farm person. It's a whole thing. So reading something that is decidedly different is always very exciting. What were some of the inspirations for the world you built? I know you said a Caribbean-inspired world. What islands? What does that mean specifically, I guess?
I'm not sure if you can hear the helicopter outside. I'm sorry. There are constantly helicopters in this neighborhood for psychological warfare, to be honest. But for the fantasy world, it's based on the U.S. Virgin Islands, which is where I'm from.
Mm-hmm.
And the U.S. Virgin Islands in itself felt like the perfect place because in terms of like oppression and being like the symbol of being like oppressed, but also having privilege, it felt like it's always felt like the U.S. Virgin Islands has been similarly in between two worlds. Where we are Americans, we're American citizens, and because of that, a lot of the other Caribbean islands do not necessarily consider us to be Caribbean enough. But at the same time, citizens of the U.S. Virgin Islands don't have the same right to vote, for example, and just aren't actually considered like full American citizens. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to set it there for that specific reason. And because of that, you get the kind of like colonial history through the U.S. Virgin Islands too, with like the Danish. We have a history with the Danish being our colonizers before they sold us to America. So that's why the specific like language and culture is used throughout.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask a little bit more about sort of that balance where, you know, they're not quite the have-nots, in the sense that you don't get the solidarity of everyone going, yep, we're all here at the bottom, and so we can all kind of be together in that. But you're also not quite the haves either. Do you think that that's in some ways a tougher position than being a have-not? I guess, because at least if you have that, you have the comfort of familiarity with other people, or is it something that's a little bit different?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about this in terms of like generations. I feel like, how far into the history rabbit do I want to go here?
I'm a history nerd, so let's do it.
For millennials, I basically feel like for millennials and for Generation X, we were kind of like raised by our parents, boomers, with this idea that we have to assimilate and we have to just work hard enough and you will not be like those other Black people who have like their baggy pants and who are selling drugs on the corner. Like that's what I was taught. Mm-hmm. And that was wrong. But that's what we were taught. If we work hard enough, we too will make it out of like this cage of racism. And as social media has boomed, we've all seen that is false. No matter how you dress, no matter what your job is, you are Black and you are still going to face racism. Mm-hmm. So I think that for our generations, Generation X and Millennials, I think Generation Z is like burn this shit to the ground. Sorry for cursing, but that's probably like why I love them so much. I feel like for Millennials and Generation X, it's been like a little bit more of a shifting period where, for example, you hear people complaining about how student loans might be canceled. I feel like those are our generations. I'm just like so angry. I'm like, come on, people might finally get their student loans canceled, but we have like this sense of, well, we worked so hard for that, so they should have to go through the same stuff also. So I feel like in that sense, it's harder. It's not harder, but it's kind of like a mental shift of having to realize, yeah, we worked hard because we gave into this lie that we were taught. Mm-hmm. But it's not helping anyone. It's not helping us. It's not helping generations before or after us. And it's kind of more of a kind of like come to Jesus moment where we just have to realize that this is not the system that we want to be a part of.
Well, and there's, I don't know about you, but I was, not always, but it was always one of those things that I was told when I was younger, which is that, suffering is terrible, but it builds character. And I think as all of us have gotten older, we've kind of looked around and gone, no, I just think suffering is suffering. I don't know that it has like an inherent positive value that is intrinsic to it. And for some people, they grow through suffering, and some people, it just kind of breaks them. So let me ask then, is it possible, and then I'm tying this back to the book, I promise, but is it possible for someone to do the wrong things for the right reasons? Because we all know you can do the right things for the wrong reasons, or you can do the right things for the wrong reasons. But is it possible or you can do the wrong things you can do the right things for the wrong reasons. But is it possible to do the inverse? I mean, Sigourney is a flawed character who's out there trying to get power, and she lies to herself about what she's really trying to do. But can there be positive outcomes anyway?
I think that's an interesting question, I feel like the answer that's immediately coming to me is this idea of like, well, what is positive and negative? Like, it's difficult to figure out. I mean, if you're looking specifically at Sigourney, it's positive that the colonizers are going to be killed.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Would you mind repeating that? We lost you for 1 second. Looks like you're kind of in and out. Give it a sec here. Let's see if we can get you back. Oh, there you are. You're back. All right. So the last thing we heard was the colonizers are going to be killed, which is a good note to pause on, frankly. But go ahead. Recap. I'm sorry.
I was saying, like, no spoilers, but that would be a positive thing for the colonizers to be killed.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that it's a little bit more nuanced in terms of, like, well, what is negative and what is positive to get to a place of, like, freedom and peace. And I don't really want to put my idea of what's positive and negative on that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that if you are harming other people actively for that route to freedom, then that is wrong. As long as someone is being harmed, that's not necessarily the right way. But I'm just kind of like thinking in terms of, like, in this day and age where so many people are saying, well, rioting is wrong and looting is wrong. I'm not going to say what is right or wrong. Like, I don't think anyone really has the I don't think anyone should have the power to say what is right or wrong, and kind of like examples like that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I'm like hesitating a little bit. Like, I think it can be a much more nuanced conversation.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know that there are necessarily answers. I tend to take the approach that that fiction, and in particular fantasy, has a really, really unique and powerful ability to hold up a lens or a microscope, or in many cases a mirror, to ourselves, to political situations, to the world around us. And it's much easier when it's not us, when it's not my team. You know, when I'm not sitting there going, oh, well, as a person who identifies with this group, I therefore have a certain level of loyalty and a certain level of blindness to the problems that group has. It's much easier with fantasy because I can go, well, but I'm not one of these gifted people. I don't have this magic, and so therefore, as an outsider, I can view it differently. So I'm always curious when I get to talk to someone who's built a world that the seeds of which were kind of based on real-world inequalities, to get a chance to sort of go, well, what do you think about that? So then let me follow it up a little bit differently. And let me change gears, I guess. And we'll come back to fixing the ills in the world, because so far I feel like we're on the right path, which is burn it all down. But what was the process like for you in writing this book? Was it you had an idea and you went, cool, I'm going to write this? Was there a moment that you kind of envisioned and you thought was cool and you sort of wanted to build around that? What was, from beginning to end, kind of what was this process like?
Yeah, this has actually been a book a lot of years in the making, many years, because it kind of like sparked, it all started with the nugget of this idea of a Black woman in a Caribbean inspired world who owned a slave, and that was an idea I had like maybe 10 years ago or so.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't ready to write that yet because I myself was not ready to see everything that I was talking about earlier with my own kind of like ideas of what it means to be a privileged person who's also oppressed. And it was really only until I spent some time in the corporate world of New York that I was literally the only Black person in the room at times, like sitting at the table and kind of feeling that moment of what it might feel like to be Sigourney, who is oppressed, who is also dealing with kind of like sometimes obvious, but sometimes more covert racism. And and then also being like very ambitious, but also kind of like need to come to terms with, well, why am I ambitious? It's because I've fallen into this kind of like capitalistic trap. Not always. I don't think ambition is necessarily wrong, but in my specific case, I think that had a lot to do with it.
Sure.
Yeah. So basically, it was just kind of like a very long period of time of me kind of like thinking, oh, well, what if this also happened? Oh, what if this also happened? And then we sold the book on proposal, and then I had like 3 months or something, really insane, like a really short amount of time to write it. But thankfully, because I'd been thinking about it for so long, it really did just kind of like flow out in the easiest way.
Oh.
It wasn't always easy, but easier than I would have expected.
So for those of us like myself who are not terribly familiar with the process of pitching and selling a book, what does selling it on proposal mean?
Yeah, we had an idea. I had an idea. I gave it to my agent, Beth Phelan. I think we had usually, well, it does depend, but I think usually proposal pages can be somewhere from like 50 to 75 pages. And I think that we sold this one on like 100 to 150 pages with a synopsis. So basically, sent not the entire book, but like the first 150 pages or so to the editors. And then what was also interesting about Queen of the Conquered was that we sent it to both YA editors and to adult editors, not really knowing which one it would end up with for sure. And I think that it's interesting to think about that, because I do think it would have been a different book if it had gone to a YA editor. I think I would have felt a little bit more confined with like how much do I want to show in terms of like violence or kind of like themes along like sexual assault and that sort of thing for the younger audience. And with adult audience, I felt like no, I just go as bleak as necessary, which for a topic like slavery is I do think it's a little harder to be confined like that.
Yeah. So that actually brings up another great point. You have written middle grade, you've written young adult, and you've now written adult fantasy. And while at times I sort of joke around and tease in the store that age recommendations, genres, they're just there. Those are all things we use to define books. They're not really definitions, if that makes sense. What's that experience been like for you writing in arguably the three age ranges? What differences have you noticed, I guess, in between writing middle grade, YA, and adult? What, conscious choices have you made with that? Or has it just been, I write the book and it goes where it goes?
I thought I had an answer for this at one point, but the more that I write new books, the more I feel like my answer changes. And at the end of the day, for a middle grade, I know, besides content, I'm sorry, I have a cat and she has the zoomies, so hopefully she doesn't like run up and leap on the laptop or something. But for middle grade, I think the main difference is just knowing that I really have to be as careful and feeling like this weight of responsibility for younger readers, because for me, when I was the middle grade age range, just around 8 to 12, I was dealing with a lot of traumas, and I was dealing with a lot of mental health issues. So just kind of like writing from that perspective, I basically imagined myself writing for a younger me, and just kind of like writing with that really careful love and responsibility of knowing that, I have like children's hands potentially, children's lives potentially in my hands, and basically just wanting to give as much hope as possible. For YA and adult, I do think the line blurs so much because adults read so much YA that it's difficult to say, besides content, what that difference is. And honestly, it's interesting because I do think adults read middle grade and YA as well. A lot of adults read middle grade because they also had traumas, or maybe they just like middle grade too. But I do think that there's a lot to do with kind of like trauma and inner child healing for adults. So a lot of adults tend to go back to their middle grade books to kind of like help them process things that they also went through. And same for YA. And for me, when I write YA, it's a lot of wish fulfillment, because I really wish that I had like a super queer, I wish I knew I was like trans and queer when I was that age, and just like living the life of like Felix and Nate and, other characters that I'm writing right now. So, it's just very like jumbled in my mind right now. I thought I had an answer for it at one point, but at this point I'm basically certain that the only thing that's definite is like for middle grade there has to be a lot of hope.
Well, first of all, I think that that's particularly beautiful. I like the idea that middle grade should be full of hope. Personally, I guess I'm 31, I am an adult. As an adult, I like the idea that adult books should be full of hope too, but I also recognize that isn't always the world. So let me ask you, there's a quote that I always really loved, which is, try and be the person that you needed when you were younger. And you sort of touched on it earlier. In writing these books, you do recognize you have these children's, lives, mental health in many ways, and hopes kind of in your hands. How much do you consider that kind of stuff when you're writing these books? And even with YA, you mentioned you wish that there was, you had that queer trans person in your life, and getting to be that for people, getting to be, write these characters for people who might be struggling understanding themselves. I can only imagine the level of responsibility that has got to be, or that has to feel for you. How much does that come into play when you're thinking about your writing? How much do you sit there and go, am I helping someone when I write this? Is this a good part of the story? What's the balancing act?
Yeah. I think about it all the time. For me, right now, has been a very kind of like healing time, which is, I don't think I'm the only one. I think a lot of people have kind of been forced to pause and rethink their lives because of COVID and the pandemic. And so because of that, a lot of us are starting to like go back to our childhood traumas, or starting to kind of like try to heal, for a lot of us, like for the first time in our lives, for me anyway, I should say. And so because of that, I think I was doing this unconsciously before anyway, which is very interesting. When I read my older books, I'm like, I was kind of doing this anyway. But now I'm very consciously basically wanting to put my own kind of like healing journey into books for the hope that it might help readers in a similar way, and to help them find peace, and to help them, especially for queer, Black, trans people who are marginalized and who really haven't seen ourselves validated or in stories before, just really kind of like creating that representation in itself is healing, but also just kind of saying like, what are the ways that we can heal from our traumas. Even Sigourney, honestly, and Lauren also kind of like have these traumas, but the thing is that they didn't heal from them, so it became a tragedy. But for the other books, each of the characters have had a trauma or a wound that they themselves have had to heal from and grow from. And basically my hope is that can also help readers.
Yeah. I think, by the way, you're completely right that this pandemic has given us all an opportunity to sort of look at ourselves and be introspective in a way that maybe wasn't something we could do before. I know myself, I know people I'm very close with have been doing a lot of soul searching. So I certainly don't think that you're alone in that. I think that you're right. It is somewhat universal, at least for people, for millennials. I can't speak to anyone else. So you mentioned a couple times that this is a tragedy. Do you define a tragedy as something where instead of the characters learning from their mistakes, they continue to make the same mistakes, or do you define it a little differently?
Yeah, that's basically how I define it. They continue to make mistakes, but then they also see consequences because of those mistakes, and they refuse to learn. So I feel like the traditional arc is characters make mistakes, they begin to learn from them, and then they grow and change, and then because of that, there's like a happy ending. For this one, it's more like they see the mistakes, they refuse to change. In Lauren's case, he does see the mistake and then decides like towards the end, okay, now I'm going to change, but it's too late. And then you see the consequences for that.
Mm-hmm. So I guess that brings up the next point is it is too late to make those changes. So you've written this to where they laid the seeds, or they sowed the seeds, I should say, of their own destruction, and then you have to reap the whirlwind. There's no walking it back, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, in terms of just like craft for writing, for me, it would be necessary that if a character refuses to make changes, that there are consequences, and they reap those consequences, because then, I mean, if you think about it, if it's just basically a story where a character like makes a bunch of mistakes and then nothing changes, in terms of like whether it's a happy ending or consequences, or if there's a happy ending and they're rewarded for those mistakes, I guess I feel like that would be a different story, and it would feel like I wouldn't really be making it would feel exactly that. I wouldn't really be making any sort of point that I would be wanting to make with this, but with these two books, I mean. But in terms of there being consequences, I feel like I am making a point that I want to make. And on top of that, yeah, there has to be an arc. I feel like it basically just, there has to be an arc, and the end with the consequences allows for that.
So, we talked a little bit about how children's books, or middle grade, I should say, you want there to be a message of hope. You want the kids to take that away. Mm-hmm. What, because this is a tragedy, is the goal of this to impart a kind of lesson on the reader? Are we supposed to take away and go, wow, following my goals at the cost of everything, even if my goals are objectively somewhat pure, is a negative? Or is it a tragedy and there's not a lesson, so to speak?
For me, there was a lesson with this. I don't think it necessarily is the case for every writer, but for these 2 books, I did want to specifically say, like, basically, don't be Sigourney Rose. Like, don't to step on other people. For Lauren, I do think it's interesting because basically the question is whether you should have empathy or whether you should burn everything to the ground. Empathy for the colonizers, I should say, specifically. And yeah, I feel like there were times when I wanted to make that a little more nuanced. Again, I don't want to give too much away, but in the end, yeah, that was another lesson too, where, well, you had too much empathy for the people that were hurting you and your people. So here are the consequences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The consequences of empathy. I like it. So we're not supposed to really like Sigourney. Who was a character that you enjoyed writing? And by the way, maybe you enjoyed writing her. But who was someone who you enjoyed writing, or you were like, you'd get to their parts and you're like, yes, this is going to be good?
Absolutely no one.
Okay.
It was a really hard book in terms of whether I actually enjoyed the process of it. Like, it felt more of a painful. Yeah, it was very painful to write a lot of these characters. I think maybe there was only one character that I did enjoy writing because she kind of naturally popped up in terms of me being a children's writer also, and just having so much hope for children and loving Generation Z so much. She kind of became almost an Easter egg, where this character's name was, now I'm going to forget, but I think it was Agnes. Mm-hmm. And she was a little girl that was on the island with Lauren and the other revolutionaries. And she was discovered to have the craft of healing. And, I'm not planning on writing any other books, but for me, I started to realize, well, it's not a coincidence that this little girl who escaped the islands after everything that happened, she was one of the few that does escape and she has the power to heal. So I think in my mind, that was kind of well, if this book series was to continue, which is not, but if it was to continue, the little girl would probably be 20 years into the future, the little girl would have grown up, she has the power to heal, and she literally comes back and heals the islands after the tragedies that happen.
So there is certainly an element of hopefulness, in theory. Not that there will be a 3rd book, because it is a duology.
Right.
But in theory.
There's not going to be a 3rd book. And I also feel like no one would have caught that anyway. So I don't know if anyone would have actually felt that hope from that little girl, but in my mind, that's what she symbolized.
I like that, though. That's really nice. So I guess let me ask sort of some closing questions. So first of all, what advice would you give to someone who's just starting out writing? If they've decided they're I'm going to be a writer, that's going to be what I do. What advice would you give someone?
This is easier said than done, and something I'm struggling with to this day too. But basically, just don't care what people think. Write the book that needs to be written. Don't care about what the reviews are going to say, or whether it's going to be on the Goodreads Best Choice list, or if it's going to win awards, or and maybe it's also easier for me to say that now, and hopefully this doesn't come across as disgustingly humble bragging, but I've won awards.
Yeah,
I've won awards, been in those positions, but from that perspective of someone who's won awards, it becomes even harder sometimes, because my next book, it's entering my brain more and more is this a book that will continue to win awards? That shouldn't be the first thing that pops into my head. It should be is this the book that I set out to write, and what is the point of this book. Like, why am I writing it? You know?
Yeah.
What impact do I think will have on readers?
Yeah. All right. So then my next question is kind of related. If you could go back and give yourself, when you were first starting out, one piece of advice, what would it be? And then in addition, what advice would you give your future self when it comes to writing?
I love that. I would go back and tell my past self to get off Twitter. Honestly, I know that Twitter is great for a lot of people. I know that it has created so much change. For me, it has not been. It's just not been helpful. It's very easy to get caught up in like the who is getting, you know, who is like a part of like the in crowd and that sort of thing. And that's just not something that I need to be thinking about as I'm writing. And I also don't think is necessarily healthy for the industry. Though I do think there are positive things. I feel like for me, the negative has overtaken everything positive. So quit Twitter is what I would tell my past self. For my future self, I am going to tell my future self already knows this, just do what I want to do and go find that cabin in the woods and just write. Like, that's all I want. Yeah. And it's okay to like, admit to that and just do it. Just go find cabin in the woods, become that hermit, isolated writer and just write.
I think that's great. I like to joke all the time that one of these days I'm just going to grab the dogs and hop in the car and go to New Hampshire and just live in a mountain, and that's just going to be what I do. I'll just live in the mountains, and periodically I will come down for supplies.
Yeah, I don't know about a mountain for me, but a forest. I definitely have looked into van life, like living in an RV or something, but it sounds like the life. It really does.
No, I get it. I'll share with you. I think I terrified my parents right after high school, because I was really debating between going to college and pursuing a degree and blah, 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 and also being a long-haul truck driver. Because I was like, no, I just kind of want to drive around all the time. That's all I really want to do. Just get in the car and just go. And it was a real debate, and we sort of compromised with, I'll go get my degree, and then if I want to be a truck driver afterwards, I can be. And there are still days where I'm like, you know, I could just get in that truck. So I think there's something really universal about that.
It's not too late. You can also sell books from a truck too.
You know what?
I think that would be pretty cool.
That's the ticket. I need to not pay that rent for the store, and we can just load everyone in the truck, and we'll just all go. It'll be me and the whole store. I know that some of them get car sick. They'll be fine. We'll just get Dramamine. And no, I'm kidding. I'm kidding for my people who are watching. Speaking of whom, by the way, and I told you this before the show, and here as we're ending, I will make sure to get the shout out. Jen, our children's buyer, adores your books, so now it is officially on the record. Jen, I hope you're watching, but I have now done my job and said the thing. For my semifinal, I say these are my final questions, and I do this every time I go, all right, for my final question, then I ask it, and then, you know, the author answers it, and I go, oh, it's a great answer, and I have one more. So I'm saying now, for my semifinal question, presumptive final question, this has been a year that globally has been like any other. I think that individually we've all had years that have been hard, and maybe even had years that were harder than this year. But this is probably the first time that I can think of where, you know, as one whole group of people, we've all kind of been suffering through some similar things. What are some things that you've done that have helped you sort of navigate this? And what are some things that you've read or been reading that you've been able to sort of enjoy in this time of, you know, crazy?
Yeah. I mean, this is a little bit of a callback to what I was saying before, but definitely just a lot of introspective work. Taking a moment to, I don't think it's a coincidence that this has happened now, and I think it's kind of like a asking of us to kind of like look within ourselves. So for me, that's been a lot of like spiritual work and a lot of what's called like shadow work, like looking at past traumas and trying to heal and trying to grow to become the person that I really want to be. So that's meant like a lot of podcasts. Like one of my favorites is it's called Spiritual Shit. I'm allowed to curse.
Yes, you.
Since I'm a children's book writer, since I'm a children's, like, am I allowed to curse? I can curse now. yeah, it's called Spiritual Shit by Aaliyah Lovely. I've been reading other books like Eckhart Tolle's books. So it's been a very, for me, it's actually been like a very grounding journey. As much as there's been like a lot of pain and isolation, it's also been what I've needed.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And in keeping with tradition, yeah, there's now a follow-up question. I'm sorry. So for my follow-up question, what are some of how did you discover shadow work? What was I've never heard that before.
So I started out on TikTok as a YA writer because I was like, I gotta learn what the Gen Z people are thinking.
Sure.
That was my research. And TikTok turned out to be, first of all, it's hilarious. And yeah, it is actually like the perfect place to actually hear what like teenagers are thinking and saying and just like whatever. I love TikTok a lot. But on TikTok, it's not necessarily just kind of like really funny videos. It also started to slowly like spiral for me into, yeah, the algorithm is weird. It's a little scary because I don't remember like looking up anything, but the algorithm slowly started to say, hey, do you have childhood trauma? And I was like, I guess, yeah. And I started to watch more and more of those videos. And then the more like childhood trauma videos I watched, the more like inner child healing videos I watched. And then the more just kind of like continued to spiral until it got to shadow work, which is basically like the things that you don't want to look at within yourself, but you, not necessarily just personality traits, but things that are kind of like your shadow, basically, like the things that scare you, your traumas, your own pains that you have.
I think.
And kind of like figuring out and deciding, okay, it's time to integrate these shadows into me. It's time to stop ignoring that because those traumas are still. Lord, I could go on a rabbit hole with this, but trauma like basically lives in the body. Like literally there's a lot of like science around that. And when you don't let go of trauma, it still affects who you are to this day. So for me, that was like realizing how trauma affects me in everyday life. Like I'm just like terrified. I'm terrified of people. I'm terrified of like that's where my social anxiety is rooted. And like kind of like actually being able to look at that is the first step in finding awareness to be able to heal from that. So, there's shadow work, there's inner child healing, there's so much. There's a lot to look at with podcasts like the one I mentioned before, with TikTok, with YouTube videos. Yeah, I could go on forever about that. But
No, I dig it. All right. We should probably end it here, otherwise we will go down the rabbit hole, which we might do afterwards. I make no promises. But obviously, I'm going to do a very quick shameless plug. If any of this sounded like fun to you, if you heard this and went, oh my god, that all sounds incredible, I would love to read a Caribbean-inspired fantasy, you can get The Conquered at Town Book Center here in Collegeville, Pennsylvania. If you're not in Collegeville, Pennsylvania, and you enjoyed this, and you think, gee, I'd like to support that guy in a local bookstore, that sounds pretty cool, or, hey, that book sounds awesome and I don't have a local bookstore and I don't really want to shop with the A word, you can always shop with us online at townbc.com. That's TOWN as in Nike, E as in Echo, B as in Bravo, C as in Charlie.com. Again, I want to thank my guest, Kacen Callender, for being here tonight and talking with me about way more than just this book, which sort of seems to be a theme that we've had here on the show. And I'm really grateful for those opportunities. So, Kacen, again, thank you so much. And to everyone else, 2020 is not over yet, so be kind to yourselves, be kind to others. Just try and be kind. And be a little brave, I guess. And we'll see you guys next time. Have a good one.
Thank you.